So last Sunday at my local Ukrainian community that I attend, it's a community that I've got very close to over the last few months in the Salvation Army building in Sunderland. We had a important visitor, Bridget Phillipson, the Secretary of State for Education. She came along to offer her support and also answer questions, um, obviously specific to her department, but also just generally offering government support. So that was a memorable visit. Um, and there was, yeah. Anyway, I went home and it's often brings a reality to this when you're meeting people, directly, when you get to know people. I mean, you switch on the news or you see the news, and some of the names that were mentioned, this is Tak and Sumi I'm talking about. Just, they could very well have been the people I was speaking to. Um, Sumi is one of the most battered cities of this war, for sure. But I remember seeing posters around the venue showing shelled buildings and nothing too graphic, but showing images of war. And I asked one of the Ukrainians, "Which city is that?" And she said that could be anywhere in Ukraine. Um, so I came back and heard this depressing news that 34 people had been killed in the city of Sumy. Shortly before that, last week, there was an attack on Kryvyi Ryi, and that was unquestionably because it was Zelensky's hometown. So it was Russia just being Russia. This is unquestionably state terrorism. These people are not military targets, they're civilians. Um, Women, children, elderly people. It's it's repulsive. And when I see these sort of things, I feel anger toward Russia, of course, but I feel possibly an even greater anger towards Russia's apologists and those shameless, disgraceful people who serve as Russian propagandists. Um, I recently had an encounter with one on Facebook. I forget the guy's name, and I don't exactly want to give him more importance than he deserves. But he was an American. He claims to live in St. Petersburg, and he's just regurgitating Russian propaganda, pictures of Putin all over his profile. And, some might say, well, it could be a Russian troll. The thing is, whilst Russia's known to do that, have bought accounts, there are some Americans and some Britons, it has to be said, and some other Westerners who are absolutely willing to serve as useful idiots. Some of them are very high profile, like Tucker Carlson. But I almost feel more contempt for these people than I do towards Russia. I think under Putin, Russia's a gangster regime. It's a thug regime. This war is about Putin's irredentist obsessions. So when the American delegation claim that they're neutral and they just want to understand the Russian side so they can have a starting point, it's actually not that difficult to understand the Russian perspective, which is irredentism. This idea of reclaiming the old Tsarist empire. Putin has never seen Ukraine as a sovereign nation. He doesn't see it as a distinct culture. He thinks it's basic Russian territory. Now, when the likes of Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio and JD Vance lecture the Ukrainians on peace, they need to really consider what Russia is doing right now. This is Russia's version of peace. There are some internal Ukrainian disputes going on. Not disputes, that's probably the wrong term, but there has been some criticism, for example, that there was going to be a military parade in Sumy. Was that reckless? Perhaps. Um, but Russia cannot claim that this was a military target when there are clearly civilians there. This wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't like trenches or military barracks or something. This was the city centre on Palm Sunday. That's another point that needs to be considered. Often when we consider it's Good Friday tomorrow, often when we consider persecution of Christians around the world, it's at the hands of Islamists, and it is. We see some horrendous persecution in countries like Nigeria and elsewhere. but actually there's persecution of Christians at the hands of Russia, ostensibly a Christian, Orthodox Christian country, and yet Ukrainians living under Russian occupation are really being hammered. Christian minority groups like Catholics, and I believe there's a small Protestant faction as well, are really having a hard time. Ukrainians are seeing that are living under occupation are seeing their entire culture phased out. I think this is a cultural genocide because Russia wants to eradicate Ukrainian culture. That would fit the definition of cultural genocide. But for Donald Trump, worst president in American history, to once again regurgitate this nonsense that Ukraine is somehow to blame for its own invasion, the victim blaming is disgusting. He says is that like equal culpability for millions dead, as he puts it. Um, how can Volodymyr Zelensky be expected to be, to have any respect for this narrative? The way this man has been smeared, the way this man has been maligned by bad actors is abhorrent. Zelensky isn't perfect, but this is a man, a young leader who has been through so much, who has done his level best to get support for his country. Now, I challenge anyone criticizing Zelensky. Any leader in his position would be doing the same thing, trying his level best to get international support. Any country that has been invaded would want international support. So this judgment about Zelensky, oh, he just wants money. Well, of course he wants money, but it's not for himself. It's not like he's fled Ukraine. It's not like he's going off on skiing holidays or something. He wants his money for his country to repel the Russian invasion. But any patronizing notions that Ukraine needs to seek peace when Russia is continuing to rain missiles down in Ukraine, it's abhorrent. And what I find so pathetic about the American argument is it's all the onus has to be on Ukraine. Now, supposedly, Trump was furious with Putin recently, um, but that's entirely personal. It's nothing to do with how Russia's treating Ukraine. I guess it's the old adage that you can't have two big egos in one room. But I don't think I think that Trump absolutely cannot be trusted when it comes to Ukraine. The strategy of Europeans so far is to kind of play the devil's advocate and assume that Trump wants the best. I honestly think that these rumours that Trump was recruited in the 80s. I don't know how much weight they have. They come from former KGB people in Kazakhstan and elsewhere. Supposedly, he had the code name Krasnov. At that time, the KGB approached senior American business personnel. But if you look at Trump's behaviour, his failure to condemn Putin directly, his victim blaming, his parroting of Russian propaganda, this doesn't look like someone who's kind of pushed into a corner. This looks like someone who's a willing participant of complicity with Russia. And it's such a sad situation. Georgia Maloney met Trump today, and she pointed out that Russia was the aggressor. She's one European leader who's close to Trump. Perhaps she's in a strong position to do this, and apparently Trump agreed with that. So the danger of Donald Trump is he flip flops. One day he'll malign the victims and claim the Ukrainians started. The next day he'll sort of concede that Russia was the aggressor. But the American position of being neutral, supposedly neutral, it's just Marco Rubio's statement on the Sumy attack, he offered condolences. Not once did he condemn Russia. So offering condolences is a bit hollow if you don't recognise what it is, an act of state terrorism. What point is those condolences if it's not coupled with recognising who the aggressor is? So I don't know if it's spinelessness from the American delegation or whether they really are um, working with Russia, perhaps for vested business interests. It is true that a growing number of Americans don't really want to continue supporting Ukraine. They see it as a distant conflict. I will say this, though. Okay, you could say that it's a distant conflict. You could say, why should we get involved? We have more pressing issues on the Mexico border. And there may be some valid point to that. I will say this, though. America cannot claim to be a leader in the world. Do not say that you're the greatest country in the world whilst you're going to basically victim blame a country that has been invaded, whilst you're going to have a leader who parrots the propaganda of a brutal dictator. American leadership has utterly declined under Trump and Vance. There's no question about that. This is not American strength. This is Americans should be embarrassed by this. So, okay, if you're living in Texas, I get it. The issues on the southern border are going to be a lot more pressing than what's happening in Ukraine. But just don't say that you're the greatest country in the world. Um, Presidents of the past, both Democrat and Republican, stood up for this sort of situation, stood up for countries that would have been invaded by a larger neighbour. What's Donald Trump doing? He's parroting to it. Imagine if Trump was a left wing leader. Imagine how Republicans would be dragging him over the coals if he was parroting, a Russian dictator. It's a bizarre upside down situation. You don't have to go that far back where Republicans were actually patriotic. Now there's this bizarre thing where patriotism is being on the same side as a Russian dictator. It just doesn't make sense. Um, and they blame Biden and they blame the Ukrainians. They'll blame everyone but Putin. It's disgusting. One of the iconic images of that atrocity was a young mother bloodied with her child. That's Russia's version of peace. And it has to be called out. European leaders do. Trump won't. Trump's a card. He will not call this out. Marco Rubio's pathetic comments. What's the point of offering condolences if you're not going to recognise who the culprits are? It's vacuous. How does this end? There may have to be some sort of deal for natural minerals. Ukraine may have to do that in return for some sort of American security guarantees. But the point here is, again, this idea that Ukraine owes America. In 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear capabilities in return for security guarantees. The Budapest Memorandum, I believe it was called. I just think it's important the way the Americans are parroting the Russian narrative. Zelensky's hit out at Steve Witkoff for basically serving Russian propaganda. But part of this has to be considered to be Trump's domestic agenda. Trump wants to pitch to people like Tucker Carlson and that sort of far right pro-Russia contingent in America. Well, look at the people he has in his cabinet. Putin fangirl Tulsi Gabbard, among others. It just shows you where this is. Interestingly enough, though, Trump's own pastor visited Ukraine and said that, we're wrong, we need to call this out. That's not verbatim, but that's essentially what it's saying, Trump's own pastor, apparently. Now, whether that's going to have any effect or not, I don't know. I don't think Trump's particularly religious. I don't think that's going to play much of a factor at all. But to do this on Easter Sunday, this atrocity, 34 people killed, dozens more wounded, it's absolute state terrorism. Shame on anyone who defends Russia. Shame on anyone who parrots Putin. I think if they live in the West, they need to be stigmatized. I think they need to be really hounded, um, peacefully speaking. But they need to be absolutely called out for how morally bankrupt they are. And I think if they work in politics or the military, then there needs to actually be scrutiny of them from an espionage point of view. I think if someone is any connections to the military, if they're a soldier, air personnel, sailor, if they are working in military capacity in any way, if they're in politics and they are regurgitating Russian propaganda, I would honestly think that it's completely valid for MI6 to be looking into them as a potential Russian asset. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I have no problem calling them traitors. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. Russia has directly threatened this country. You get firebrands on Russian state TV openly calling for nuclear war on Western cities. And if anyone needs reminded, Russia did carry out chemical warfare in the streets of Britain in Salisbury. The only thing Putin cares about is his irredentist obsessions. Is his irredentist obsessions. Putin's a killer, a thug, a liar, um, and I just think that there cannot be an approach which dictates to the Ukrainians just to give up their country, to have no security guarantees, to it's abhorrent. And one last thing I'll say on this, often those who parrot Russian propaganda tend to be from African and Asian countries. What I would say to those people is, how would you feel if your country was invaded and a third party came in and said, indeed, I'd say that to the Americans. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, the United States was invaded and a big chunk of the US was occupied, say Florida and the Carolinas. And a third party came in and said, oh, well, it's entirely your fault. You don't want peace. Come back to us when you want peace. How would the Americans take that? That's how they're treating Ukraine. It's, I mean, it's one thing to have support from Europe, but the United States is still a military superpower. So for the American side to be taking this approach, it may be that Zelensky has to, there's real politics involved in this in dealing with Donald Trump. He may have to have some sort of agreement regarding natural resources. I accept that there may have to be something along those lines, but Zelensky is right to call out those who regurgitate Russian propaganda, and I just hope that Europe doesn't waver. I'm proud of my country. I'm proud that we're on the right side of this, but even with British and French support, German support, Italian support, the United States is the most powerful country in the world as it stands. So unfortunately, it is symbolic that the American delegation is repeating Russian propaganda, and I think it's disgusting that they blame Ukraine for starting the war. I think actually other Western countries need to be a little bit more outspoken on that and say unequivocally who the aggressor is. And they do, Starmer criticizes Russia and so on, but frankly, I think we're too cautious in terms of not offending Trump. Starmer needs to say, I disagree with the American position. Absolutely, Russia is the aggressor. But this is state terrorism, and it's what it's going to do. Even if this war ends, it's going to cause generational contempt. There's going to be long-standing Russophobia in Ukraine because of what they've been through. This is the irony. Putin cited Russophobia as one of his reasons for invasion. But if you've had your entire family killed, even good-willed Russians who stand against Putin, there's going to be a collective thing whereby there's going to be a collective Russophobia, something similar to the anti-German sentiments that were in this country after World War II, because people remembered the Blitz. So for Ukrainians who've lost everything, they've lost family members, who've seen their children murdered, they've been displaced. Even if there's peace, like a settled peace, there's going to be anti-Russian sentiments for decades. And I, as an outsider, whilst I don't think that all Russians should be collectively vilified, there are Russians who courageously stand against Putin. It's not. I don't think it's my place to lecture Ukrainians on that with what they've been through. And I would say the point has come where those Russians who do oppose Putin, maybe they should consider changing their passport. Taking that further step. I do have a lot of respect for them. I do think they take real risks, and they're 100 times braver than those pathetic Putin stooges living in the West. But this is a total war, and it's being waged on civilians. Let's also not forget Ukrainian children have been kidnapped by Russia. There's cultural genocide going on. This is what Ukraine's going through, and it strengthens my resolve, my pro-Ukraine resolve. But I also feel utter disgust at the current position of the White House to actually blame Ukraine for what's going on. It's an utter failure of leadership. And deep down, Marco Rubio must know, like I say, he's someone who once spoke against dictatorships. Now he's serving a president who panders to dictatorships, and specifically the Putin dictatorship. But what Russia is doing is unquestionably state terrorism, and it must not be allowed to be forgotten.